The crash of splintering wood ripped me from sleep like a physical blow. For a heartbeat, I lay frozen in that strange space between dream and reality, my mind scrambling to make sense of the chaos erupting around me. Then the shouting started. Male voices, harsh and commanding, flooding through our home like a violent tide that swept away any hope this might be a nightmare. Daniel's body went rigid beside me, his hand instinctively reaching for mine in the darkness. But before our fingers could touch, our bedroom door exploded inward, and suddenly our sanctuary became a war zone. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness like swords, blinding me as figures in tactical gear swarmed into our bedroom. I couldn't count how many there were. Everything moved too fast, too violent, too surreal. Get down now! The commands came from everywhere at once, overlapping and echoing off our walls. I tried to comply, but my limbs felt disconnected from my brain. Daniel was already moving, his hands raised, his voice steady despite the tremor I could hear underneath. "There are children in this house," he said quietly, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. Strong hands guided me to the floor, not rough, but firm enough that I had no choice. The carpet pressed against my cheek, and I could smell the familiar scent of our laundry detergent, mixed with something foreign and frightening. Through the chaos, I heard Maya crying from down the hall. My daughter's terrified sob. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the commotion. "Please, my children are scared." The officer's grip loosened slightly, but he didn't let me go. They separated us immediately. I found myself in our living room, wrapped in a blanket someone had thrown over my nightgown, watching strangers rifle through our belongings like we were criminals. Officer Johnson, the one who seemed to be in charge, kept asking questions I couldn't answer. Where were the drugs? What did I know about the weapons? Who were our contacts? Each question felt like a punch to the stomach. I kept repeating the same words over and over. "I don't understand. You have the wrong house. We don't have anything." Through the archway, I could see Daniel in the kitchen, surrounded by 3 officers. His hands were cuffed behind his back, but his posture was too calm, too controlled for someone experiencing this for the first time. That observation hit me like ice water. Daniel wasn't panicking the way I was. He wasn't demanding explanations or shouting about their mistake. He was answering their questions with a measured precision that felt rehearsed. I tried to catch his eye, but he wouldn't look at me. That's when the first real tendril of doubt crept into my chest, cold and unwelcome as winter fog. My daughter appeared at the top of the stairs, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her face streaked with tears. Jake stood behind her, thumb in his mouth, despite being 6 years old. "Mummy?" Maya's voice was so small, so broken. I wanted to run to her, to shield her from this nightmare, but the officer beside me shook his head when I started to stand. "It's okay, sweetheart," I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "Go back to your room and stay with Jake. Mummy will be there soon." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue. Officer Johnson's radio crackled with static and urgent voices. I caught fragments of conversation, words that made no sense. Negative on the location, cross-reference the address, possible administrative error. Administrative error. The phrase hung in the air like smoke, acrid and stifling. I watched Johnson's expression change from aggressive certainty to something that looked suspiciously like confusion. 20 minutes later, they began to withdraw. No explanations, no apologies, just a gradual exodus that left our home looking like a crime scene and our lives scattered like broken glass. After they left, silence settled over our house like a suffocating blanket. I stood in our ravaged living room, trying to process what had just happened, while simultaneously trying to pretend everything was fine for the children. Daniel moved through the rooms, mechanically righting overturned furniture and collecting scattered papers. His movements were efficient, practiced, like he'd done this before. The thought made my stomach clench. "Daniel," I started, but he held up a hand without looking at me. "Let's just get the kids settled first," he said quietly. then we'll talk. Putting Maya and Jake back to bed felt like trying to convince them that monsters weren't real, while the evidence of their claws was still fresh on our walls. Maya asked questions I couldn't answer. Why were those men in our house? Were we in trouble? Would they come back? I stroked her auburn hair, so much like my own, and whispered reassurances I didn't believe. Jake didn't ask questions. He just curled up against me, his small body trembling with leftover fear. When I finally tucked them both in, their eyes were still wide and watchful in the darkness. Daniel was waiting for me in our bedroom, sitting on the edge of our bed with his head in his hands. When he looked up, I saw something in his blue eyes I'd never seen before. Guilt. They said it was a mistake, I said, testing the words, watching his reaction. Wrong address, administrative error. That's what Officer Johnson told me. Daniel nodded, but his gaze slipped away from mine. That's good, he said. That means this is over. But his voice carried no relief, only a weight that pressed down on both of us. But I wanted to believe him. I wanted to accept the official explanation and move forward, pretend this was just a terrible mix-up that we'd laugh about someday in the distant future. But I couldn't shake the image of Daniel's face when those officers burst through our door. Not surprise, not confusion, but recognition. And beneath that, something that looked disturbingly like resignation. Daniel, I whispered in the darkness of our bedroom. Is there something you need to tell me? The silence that followed was answer enough. Dawn came reluctantly, filtering through our damaged front door where the wood had splintered around the locks. I made coffee with shaking hands, while Daniel called his work to explain why he wouldn't be in. His conversation was brief, professional, but I noticed he stepped outside to make it. Through the kitchen window, I watched him pace our small backyard, the phone pressed tightly to his ear. When he came back inside, he kissed my forehead like it was any other morning, but his lips felt cold, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. Captain Brooks held a press conference that afternoon. I watched it on our tablet while the children napped, Daniel sitting beside me on our couch that still bore the imprint of combat boots. Due to an administrative error in our database, officers responded to an incorrect address during last night's operation, Brooks said smoothly. The department regrets any inconvenience caused to the affected family. Inconvenience. The word felt obscene. I looked at Daniel, expecting to see anger, but his expression was carefully neutral. Too neutral. Mrs. Patterson knocked on our door that evening, bringing a casserole and barely concealed curiosity. Our elderly neighbor's eyes darted past me, taking in the damage, cataloging details she'd share over backyard fences. Such a terrible mistake, she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced it was a mistake at all. You poor dear. You must have been terrified. I was still terrified, but not for the reasons she imagined. The fear had shifted, becoming something more personal and infinitely more dangerous. That night, Daniel lay beside me like a coiled spring. Every small sound made him tense. Every shadow seemed to catch his attention. I pretended to sleep while watching him through barely opened eyes. Around midnight, he slipped out of bed and moved to the window, pushing the curtain aside, just enough to scan our quiet street. He stood there for nearly an hour, motionless as a sentinel. When he finally returned to bed, he whispered something so softly I almost missed it. I'm sorry, Em. I'm so sorry. 3 days later, I found it while gathering laundry from Daniel's dresser. A phone I'd never seen before, tucked beneath his socks like a guilty secret. It was a cheap flip phone, the kind people used when they didn't want to be traced. My hands trembled as I held it, staring at this concrete evidence that my husband was hiding something from me. The call log showed numbers I didn't recognize and text messages that made my blood run cold. Status update required. They're asking questions. Maintain cover. I waited until the children were at school, then placed the phone on our kitchen table like evidence in a trial. Daniel walked in from his morning shower and stopped dead, when he saw it. "Emma," he started, but I held up a hand, mimicking his gesture from that terrible night. My voice was steadier than I felt when I finally spoke. "Who are you?" The question hung between us like a chasm I wasn't sure we could cross. Daniel sat down across from me, and for a moment I glimpsed the man I'd fallen in love with 8 years ago. Vulnerable, honest, real. Then the mask slipped back into place. "It's not what you think," he said, reaching for my hand. I pulled away, and the hurt in his eyes looked genuine. "I can't explain everything right now, but I need you to trust me." Trust, the word felt foreign now, like something from a language I used to speak fluently, but had somehow forgotten. Daniel left for work that morning the same way he had for 5 years, kissing my cheek and telling me he'd be home by 6. But now I wondered where he really went, who he really worked for, and what other lies were woven into the fabric of our life together. I stood at our living room window, watching his car disappear around the corner, and realized I had no idea if I'd ever really known him at all. The house felt different with him gone, like the walls themselves were holding secrets. I started paying attention to things I'd previously ignored. The way Daniel sometimes received calls that made him step outside, how he never brought colleagues home from work. The fact that in 5 years of marriage, I'd never been to a company party or met his boss. Small things that had seemed like quirks now felt like carefully constructed lies. I made a list, my handwriting growing shakier with each revelation. By lunchtime, I had filled 3 pages with inconsistencies I'd been too trusting to question. That afternoon, I drove to Daniel's office building to surprise him with lunch. What I saw in the parking lot made me park across the street instead. Daniel stood beside a black sedan, talking intently with a man in plain clothes who had the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. Their conversation looked heated, urgent. As I watched, the man handed Daniel an envelope. My husband's shoulders sagged as he took it, like he was accepting a death sentence. The man noticed me watching and walked over to my car. He was older, weathered, with kind eyes that didn't match the gravity of his expression. "Mrs. Williams?" He used Daniel's last name, the name on our mailbox, but something in his tone made it sound like a question. "I'm Detective Martinez. I think we need to talk." My heart hammered against my ribs as I rolled down my window. "About what?" I managed to ask, though we both knew the answer. Detective Martinez suggested we talk somewhere private. The coffee shop he chose was small, quiet, filled with the kind of people who minded their own business. "Your husband is a good man," he began, stirring sugar into his black coffee, "but he's in a complicated situation that's about to become more complicated." I gripped my mug like an anchor. What kind of situation? My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. "Daniel isn't who you think he is," Martinez said gently. "The name, the background, even some of his history, it was all constructed to protect him, and by extension, to protect you and your children." The words hit me like physical blows. I thought about our wedding, our children's birth certificates, the life we'd built together. How much of it was real? "Protect him from what?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Martinez didn't answer directly. Instead, he slid a manila envelope across the table, its contents thick and ominous. "These arrived at the station yesterday. They're addressed to you." Inside were photographs. Daniel with a woman I'd never seen before. They looked intimate, familiar, like lovers sharing secrets. But Daniel's expression in the photos was wrong, protective, rather than romantic. The last photo made my blood freeze. It showed our house taken from across the street, recent, based on Maya's bicycle in the driveway. Tucked behind the photographs was a note, written in careful block letters. "Tell her the truth before it's too late. She deserves to know what she's married to." My hands shook as I read the words again. Martinez watched me with professional sympathy, letting me process this violation of our privacy, our safety. "Who sent these?" I asked, though my voice barely rose above a whisper. The coffee shop suddenly felt too exposed, too public. Her name is Sarah Chen, Martinez said quietly. She was involved in a case Daniel worked 5 years ago. Before he became Daniel, if you understand what I mean. I studied the photos again. Sarah was beautiful in a haunted way, with long black hair and eyes that held too much knowledge. In every image, she looked at my husband like he was both her salvation and her destruction. Where is she now? The question came out sharper than I intended. I drove home in a daze, the envelope burning like fire in my purse. The familiar streets of our neighborhood looked different now, less safe, filled with shadows and possibilities I didn't want to consider. Our house stood quiet in the afternoon sun, but I found myself checking the street for watching eyes, unfamiliar cars, signs that our private life was being observed. Inside, everything looked normal. Maya's art projects on the refrigerator, Jake's toys scattered across the living room floor. The debris of a life I'd thought was real. Daniel came home at 6:15, later than usual. He found me in the kitchen, the envelope spread across the counter like evidence at a crime scene. His face went white when he saw the photographs. Not surprise, I realized. Recognition. And underneath that, a fear that made my stomach clench with dread. Emma, he said, my name heavy with exhaustion and something that sounded like grief. Is Sarah Chen the reason our house was raided? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. Is she the reason my children were terrorized in their own beds? Daniel sank into a chair, suddenly looking older than his 35 years. When he finally met my eyes, I saw the man I'd married warring with someone I didn't recognize. It's complicated, he said, and I wanted to scream at the inadequacy of those words. My real name is David Chen, he began, and even his voice sounded different somehow. I was married to Sarah 8 years ago, before I met you, before I became Daniel Williams. The floor seemed to shift beneath my feet. Married. He'd been married before and I'd never known. How many other fundamental truths about my husband were lies? What happened to her? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Sarah got involved with people she shouldn't have. Dangerous people. Vincent Romano's organization. Daniel's hands shook as he spoke the name, like it had power even here in our kitchen. I tried to get her out, but she was in too deep. The only way to save her was to help the FBI bring Romano down from the inside. The pieces began clicking together in my mind, forming a picture I didn't want to see. I wore a wire for 6 months, Daniel continued. Recorded meetings, gathered evidence, testified in front of grand juries. When it was over, Romano's network was in pieces, but they knew I was the one who destroyed them. I thought about the raid, the systematic way they'd searched our house, not looking for drugs or weapons, but for something else entirely. So they gave you a new identity, I said. It wasn't a question. Sarah disappeared the night before the final arrests, Daniel said, his voice barely audible. The FBI thought Romano's people had killed her. I thought so too, until 3 weeks ago. My blood turned to ice water. She's alive! Again, not a question. The photographs made terrible sense now. She contacted me through old channels, said she'd been hiding, planning. She blames me for everything that went wrong with her life. Sarah orchestrated the raid, Daniel continued. She has contacts inside Romano's old network, people who want revenge but were never caught. She gave the Rauer address, told them I was living here under a false name. The violation felt even worse now, knowing it came from someone with intimate knowledge of my husband's past. Someone who had loved him first. She wants to hurt me by hurting you and the children. I stared at the photographs spread across our kitchen counter. In every image, Sarah looked at Daniel with an intensity that was part love, part hatred, entirely dangerous. Does she know about Maya and Jake? My voice broke on our children's names. The thought of them becoming pawns in someone else's game of revenge made me physically sick. Daniel's silence was answer enough. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang, unknown number, but somehow I knew who it would be before I answered. Emma? The voice was soft, almost gentle. My name is Sarah. I think we should meet. I looked at Daniel, who had gone pale as winter. In the background of the call, I could hear traffic, city sounds. She was close. You don't know who you're married to, Sarah continued, her voice taking on an edge that made my skin crawl. David destroyed my life, and now he's destroying yours with his lies. What do you want? I managed to ask, though my throat felt like it was closing. I want him to tell you the truth, all of it, about what really happened 8 years ago. Daniel was already reaching for the phone, but I pulled away. Something in Sarah's voice, underneath the anger and pain, sounded like a woman who had been broken by circumstances beyond her control. What truth? I asked, ignoring Daniel's increasingly frantic gestures. Ask him about the night I disappeared, Sarah said. Ask him why he never looked for me. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone like it might hold more answers. Daniel sat across from me, his face a mask of guilt and fear. She's not well, he said finally. 8 years of hiding, of thinking everyone she trusted betrayed her. It's damaged her. But I was thinking about her words, about truths still untold. What happened the night Sarah disappeared? I asked, setting my phone aside, but keeping my eyes on Daniel's face. I'd learned to read his expressions in the past week, to catch the micro-expressions that revealed his lies. He was quiet for so long, I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old grief. We fought about the case, about what I was doing to Romano's people. She said I'd become someone she didn't recognize. Sarah wanted me to start cooperating with the FBI, Daniel continued. She said we should disappear together, start over somewhere Romano's network would never find us. I could picture it, a desperate woman asking the man she loved to choose between justice and safety, between duty and love. But you chose the case, I said. I told her I had to finish what I'd started, that too many people would get hurt if Romano stayed free. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. She said if I wouldn't choose her, she'd make the choice for both of us. The photographs on our counter seemed to pulse with renewed significance. A woman who felt abandoned, betrayed by the person she trusted most. She left that night. By morning, her apartment was cleaned out, like she'd never existed. I watched Daniel's face as he relived that night, saw the weight of old regrets pulling at his features. This was why he'd never spoken of a previous marriage, why his past had seemed to begin the day he met me. I thought she was dead for 8 years, he whispered. I mourned her. I blamed myself. But you never looked for her, I said, remembering Sarah's words. Daniel's silence stretched between us like a chasm. When he finally looked at me, his eyes held a truth I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. I couldn't, he said simply. The FBI made it clear that any contact with my old life would put both of us in danger. I had to choose between looking to Sarah and keeping you and the children safe. Another choice, another betrayal in Sarah's eyes. The next morning, I found it while retrieving the newspaper. A small box wrapped in brown paper, my name written in the same careful block letters as the threatening note. Inside was a cell phone and a single piece of paper. If you want answers, be at Riverside Park at 3 p.m. Come alone. Daniel found me staring at the package, and his face went ashen when he saw the phone. You're not meeting her, Daniel said immediately. It's too dangerous. Sarah isn't the woman I knew 8 years ago, but I was already making my decision. I needed to hear her side of the story, to understand what had really happened between them. To know what I was truly married to. She could have hurt the children already if that's what she wanted, I said. She wants to talk. I arrived early, choosing a bench near the playground, where mothers pushed their toddlers on swings, where normalcy provided a buffer against whatever was coming. Sarah appeared at exactly 3 o'clock, and I recognized her immediately from the photographs. but seeing her in person revealed details the images had missed. The hollowness in her cheeks, the way she constantly scanned her surroundings, the careful distance she maintained from everyone around her. She looked like a woman who had been running for 8 years. "Thank you for coming," Sarah said, sitting on the far end of my bench. Up close, I could see she was beautiful in a fragile way, like porcelain that had been cracked and badly repaired. "I want you to know I never intended for your children to be scared," she continued. "The raid was meant to flush David out, make him reveal himself. I didn't think about the collateral damage." Her honesty was unexpected, disarming. "David thinks I disappeared by choice," Sarah said, watching children play on the swings. "The truth is, I was taken. Romano's people found out about the investigation before the arrests happened. My blood went cold. Taken? They kept me for 3 years, trying to get information about what David had told the FBI. When I finally escaped, David was already married to you, living his new life." Sarah's voice remained steady as she described those lost years, but I could see the cost in the way her hands shook, the careful way she held herself together. "I've spent the last 5 years trying to rebuild some kind of life," she said. "But everywhere I go, I see shadows of Romano's network. People who remember, who still want revenge." I thought about my children, sleeping safely in their beds, unaware of the dangers that had been circling our family. "The raid wasn't just about David," Sarah continued. "Romano's son, Vincent Jr., has been building his own organization. He wants to finish what his father started." The playground suddenly felt less safe, the mothers and children around us more vulnerable. I found myself scanning faces, looking for threats I wouldn't recognize. "He's been watching your family for months, waiting for the right moment to act." "I could have stayed hidden," Sarah said, finally turning to look at me directly. "But when I realized Vincent Jr. was targeting your children to get to David, I couldn't stay silent." There was something in her eyes that reminded me of myself, of the fierce protectiveness I felt for Maya and Jake. Whatever else she was, Sarah Chen was a woman who understood the need to shield innocent children from adult sins. "What does he want?" I asked. "Vincent Jr. wants David to confess publicly that his testimony against Romano Sr. was fabricated," Sarah explained. "He wants to discredit the entire case, get the convictions overturned." The political implications made my head spin, but the personal cost was crystal clear. And if David refuses, Sarah's silence was more terrifying than any threat she could have voiced. I drove home with Sarah's revelations burning in my chest. Our house looked different now, not just damaged, but actively dangerous. Every window could hide a watcher, every shadow could conceal a threat. Daniel was pacing the living room when I entered, his phone pressed to his ear. "She's back," he said to whoever was on the other end. Then hung up when he saw my expression. "You talked to her," he said. "Not a question." I told Daniel everything Sarah had shared, watching his face cycle through shock, guilt, and a growing fear that matched my own. "She was taken," he repeated, like he couldn't quite process the words. "All these years, I thought she chose to disappear." "But you never looked for her," I said again, and this time he had a different answer. "The FBI told me she was dead," Daniel said quietly. "They showed me photos of her apartment after it was ransacked, blood on the walls. They said Romano's people had made an example of her." Another lie, another manipulation by people who were supposed to protect them both. I grieved for her, Emma. And then I met you, and I thought maybe I could have a second chance at happiness. Agent Torres arrived that evening with a team that transformed our home into a fortress. She was professional, efficient, but I could see the strain around her eyes as she explained the situation. "Vincent Romano Jr. has been building his organization for the past 5 years," she said, spreading files across our dining room table. "Sarah Chen's emergence has accelerated his timeline." The photos she showed us looked like surveillance images from a crime movie. Men in expensive suits, meetings in parking garages, money changing hands. We're moving your family to a safe house tonight, Agent Torres continued. This house is compromised, and we can't guarantee your safety here. Maya and Jake took the news with the resilience of children, turning the upheaval into an adventure. But I could see the questions in Maya's eyes, the way she watched Daniel when she thought no one was looking. Our daughter was starting to sense that her father wasn't exactly who she believed him to be. The safe house was a nondescript suburban home that felt like a movie set, all generic furniture and blank walls. Agent Torres assured us it was temporary, but temporary had become a frightening concept. That first night, I lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds. The hum of surveillance equipment, the quiet footsteps of federal agents patrolling our perimeter, the whispered conversations of people whose job it was to keep us alive. Daniel slept beside me, but his rest was fitful, haunted by dreams I couldn't share. The next morning, Agent Torres told us Sarah had agreed to testify about her years in captivity, providing evidence that could dismantle Vincent Jr.'s organization before it fully formed. Her testimony could put him away for life, Torres explained, but it also makes her the primary target. I thought about the broken woman I'd met in the park, summoning the courage to face her captors again. Vincent Romano Jr.'s trial began 3 weeks later. I watched the news coverage from our safe house, seeing my husband's face on television as reporters discussed his role in the original case against Romano Sr. Sarah's testimony was devastating. Day after day, she recounted her years in captivity with a quiet strength that commanded the courtroom's attention. But I could see the cost in her eyes each night when the coverage showed her leaving the courthouse. When the jury returned their verdict, guilty on all counts, I felt a relief so profound it left me weak. Vincent Romano Jr. would spend the rest of his life in prison, unable to threaten our family or anyone else's. Agent Torres smiled when she delivered the news, the first genuine expression of joy I'd seen from her. "It's over," she said simply. Going back to our house felt like visiting a crime scene. The damage from the raid had been repaired, but the violation lingered in every room. Maya and Jake adapted quickly, as children do, but I found myself checking locks obsessively, watching shadows, jumping at unexpected sounds. Daniel was different too, more present but also more fragile, like a man learning to live without constantly looking over his shoulder. She came to our door on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, looking healthier than she had in the park, but no less haunted. I invited her in, though Daniel tensed when he saw her through the window. "I'm leaving the city," she said simply, "starting over somewhere new. I wanted to apologize for the fear I caused your children." I offered her coffee, and we sat in my kitchen like old friends sharing secrets. "I was angry for so long," Sarah said, cradling her mug like it was precious. "At David, at the FBI, at everyone who moved on while I was trapped in that nightmare." She looked at Daniel, who sat stiffly across from us. "I blamed you for choosing justice over love, but I understand now. You saved more lives than just mine." The forgiveness in her voice seemed to lift a weight from Daniel's shoulders. Sarah left our lives as quietly as she'd entered them, but her impact lingered. Daniel and I spent long nights talking about trust, about the lies we tell to protect the people we love, about the cost of secrets in a marriage. We started couples therapy with Dr. Williams, working through the damage that deception had done to our foundation. Some days were harder than others. Maya asked questions we couldn't fully answer. Why had those men come to our house? Why did we have to live in the safe house? Why did Daddy sometimes look so sad? We told her age-appropriate truths, that Daddy had helped capture bad people, and sometimes that made other bad people angry, that we were safe now, that the bad people couldn't hurt us anymore. She seemed to accept this, but I noticed she stayed closer to home, played less with neighborhood children. Our son was too young to articulate his fears, but they manifested in nightmares that had him crawling into our bed most nights. He'd wake crying about the loud men and the scary lights. Dr. Williams said it was normal that children process trauma through dreams and play. But watching my 6-year-old son flinch at unexpected sounds broke my heart in ways I couldn't express. Time would heal these wounds, she assured us. Children were resilient. The hardest part wasn't adjusting to our new reality, but learning to trust each other again. Daniel's secrets, even those kept to protect us, had damaged something fundamental in our relationship. We worked at it daily, in small ways and large ones. He showed me his phone without being asked. He answered every question, no matter how painful. He let me into parts of his past he'd kept locked away. Slowly, carefully, we began to rebuild what we'd lost. 6 months after the trial, our lives settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Daniel returned to work, though he changed jobs to something that required complete transparency with his family. I went back to my part-time teaching position, finding comfort in the routine of lesson plans and parent conferences. The children's laughter filled our house again, but I still checked the locks twice before bed, and Daniel still sometimes woke in the night, listening for sounds that weren't there. On the anniversary of the raid, we didn't talk about it, but that evening, after the children were asleep, Daniel and I sat together on our back porch, holding hands in the gathering darkness. Do you ever regret it? I asked quietly. Not the secrets, but choosing to testify in the first place. He was quiet for a long time before answering. No, he said finally, but I regret the cost. 2 years after Vincent Romano Jr.'s conviction, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. Sarah standing on a beach somewhere warm, the face turned toward the sun, genuinely smiling for what might have been the first time in years. On the back, she'd written, "Found my new beginning. Thank you for helping me remember what forgiveness looks like." I showed the photo to Daniel, and we both smiled. The experience taught us things about ourselves and each other that we might never have discovered otherwise. About the strength that comes from facing your worst fears together. About the cost of secrets and the value of truth. Maya grew up a little that year, becoming more serious but also more compassionate. Jake's nightmares faded, replaced by dreams of adventure and heroism. We learned that love can survive almost anything, but it requires constant tending, like a garden that needs daily care. We're different now than we were before that terrible night, but we're also stronger, more honest, more aware of how precious and fragile our safety really is. Daniel is still Daniel to the children and me, regardless of what name he was born with. Identity, we learned, is more about the choices we make than the history we carry. And our home, repaired and secured, filled with new memories and old love, remains our sanctuary. There are still hard days when the weight of what we've been through settles over our house like fog. When Daniel stares out the window too long, or when I catch myself checking locks that are already secure. But there are more good days now. Days when we laugh at Maya's terrible jokes and watch Jake discover the world with wonder. Days when Daniel and I fall asleep holding hands. No secrets between us. Recovery isn't a destination, we've learned. It's a daily choice to keep moving forward. As I write this, Maya is 10 and Jake is 8. They're healthy, happy children who've learned that sometimes bad things happen to good people, but that love and courage can overcome almost anything. Daniel and I are planning our second honeymoon, this time with complete honesty between us. Agent Torres sends Christmas cards and occasionally updates us on cases she thinks we'd find interesting. Sarah never contacted us again, but sometimes I hope she's found the peace she was searching for on that distant beach. Our house still bears invisible scars from that night 3 years ago, but it's filled with new memories now. Birthday parties and Halloween decorations, school projects on the kitchen table, and soccer cleats by the front door. We've learned that home isn't just a place where you sleep safely, though that matters too. Home is where people know your real name and love you anyway. where forgiveness lives alongside truth, and where second chances bloom like flowers after a long winter. If I could go back and change things, would I? The question haunts me sometimes, usually in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world feels fragile and uncertain. Would I choose a different life? One without raids and safe houses and federal agents? A simpler love story without the complications of buried pasts and dangerous truths. But then I watched Daniel help Jake with his homework, patient and gentle. And I remember, this is the man I fell in love with, secrets and all. The truth is messier than I once believed. People aren't simply good or bad, honest or deceptive. They're complex beings, carrying histories that shape them in ways both beautiful and terrible. Daniel made choices that hurt people he loved, but also choices that protected strangers he'd never meet. Sarah survived horrors that would have broken many people, then chose justice over revenge. And I learned that love isn't about perfect people finding each other. It's about imperfect people choosing each other again and again through whatever storms may come. This morning, I woke to the sound of my children laughing in the kitchen. Daniel making pancakes while they told him about their dreams. Ordinary sounds in an ordinary house on an ordinary Tuesday. But ordinary feels precious now in ways it never did before. The simple gift of safety, of truth between us, of futures we can plan without looking over our shoulders. I think about the woman I was before that night, how much I took for granted, how much I assumed would always be there. From the wreckage of lies and secrets, we've built something stronger, a family that's been tested and survived, love that's been examined under the harshest lights and found to be real. Maya wants to be a police officer when she grows up, or maybe a teacher, like me. Jake changes his career plans daily, but always includes helping people in his descriptions. They've learned that heroes aren't perfect, but they try to do right even when it's hard. If our story has taught me anything, it's that the most important truths are often the simplest ones. Love matters. Family matters. The courage to do right matters more than the cost. That night changed everything and nothing. We're still the same people who love each other, who worry about homework and soccer practice and what to have for dinner. But we're also people who stared into the darkness and found our way back to the light, together.